Hey, this is Dave with the Shepherd School, and today I want to talk about media and media frames. The content of what we're talking about today is excerpted from a college class I used to teach on terrorism. And I'm going to try to kind of cut it down and be brief so that, we only talk for a couple minutes versus the normal 2 hours that I give to this topic. But I think that it's very useful for us today, especially as we see how the media bias is really affecting how people look at issues. All right, we're going to use terrorism as an example because it works well, but as I said a second ago, these concepts work well for everything. But terrorism is a very symbolic type of communication. And really, the victim of the act of terrorist isn't the target of those communications. Really, terrorism involves actions used to make other people do what you want. Your victim's already dead. And that makes it very dramatic. And because drama is needed to feed this 24-hour news cycle, terrorism plays really well in the media, right? Now, terrorism as a means to communicate is very effective. So, government has to respond to that with competing messages. And the way these communications, they develop in three different ways. You've got the reporting of the terrorist events, and then the media frames a terrorist event in order to create a social definition for terrorism. And then the internet becomes a conduit both for communication and for propaganda. So for the data, right, the actual information, and for the ways that we try to elicit a response based upon the data. Now, there's a whole lot of misconceptions about the media and the way the media is used. And I guess the first thing we need to say is everybody in the public eye wants to use media to their advantage, and so they all compete to get the media to frame them favorably. And the media's ability to create these images, or to sustain these images, it's called myth-making, right? And in myth-making, viewers are encouraged to accept a few isolated facts, some simple things, even though the issue may be complicated. And that allows the creation of misappropriated labels, right? And people accept that. Just like, say, the gun control issue today. It's a whole lot more complex than the media discusses as far as the solutions to violence, but, the media has people who accept just a few isolated facts. Now, to give you another example of that, the OSS had a psychological profile of Hitler, and it's very telling. All right. Now, according to the OSS, the rules that Hitler lived by were never allow the public to cool off, never admit a fault, never concede that there's some good in your enemy, never leave room for alternatives, never accept blame, concentrate on one enemy at a time and blame him for everything that goes wrong, and if people will believe a big lie sooner than a little one because no one would believe that you have enough, impudence to say something that big, right? So if you tell a big lie, tell it often enough, people will believe it. Okay, along with those misconceptions, the people tend to believe that the media favors the governments. And that might be true. There might be a little bit of bias there. But as far as law enforcement often finds themselves at odds with the media. And that's because government has to compete for media attention, but the social constructions that involve media often compete with government objectives, right? The media needs news. They don't necessarily care where they get it, right? And so law enforcement goals often conflict with the goal of media reporters, right? Look at the Dorner shooting the other day. The media needed to be there on scene, but law enforcement did not want anyone there, right? Media is a weapon. A lot of folks use it as a weapon. And just like a gun, first one to pick it up is the one that gets to use it, right? If you're late to the party, too late, the media's already against you. It don't matter, right? And because of that, the government wants to make pretty skillful use of the media. And so I've got some examples here of some free courses that the government has, independent study courses through FEMA, to teach people how to use the media, right? What employees can and cannot say on the scene of an emergency, right? Now, as far as terrorists goes, al-Zawahiri, he used the media as a powerful tool in Al-Qaeda's arsenal. The attacks dramatized the struggle. It was framed as them against us. You know, those attacks got a lot of coverage, and the reports of that coverage played very well with Al-Qaeda sympathizers. You know, we're over here wailing and gnashing teeth, and they're evil, but we're calling them jihadists, holy warriors. You know, these holy warriors attacked us, and no, it was terrible. All right, well, to a sympathizer, it's wow, these holy warriors, they're really using my money and doing a good job, and you know, sacrificing themselves for righteousness. And so that really helped them, because you have to realize the victims of the terrorist attack were not the people that Al Qaeda is trying to communicate with, right? And their literature uses three media strategies. The first thing is it needs to seek legitimacy and justify the violence, right? If you look at Oklahoma City, the militia movement in the United States was growing, but then when the guy come up and he blew Oklahoma City up, the people, the public didn't react to the federal agents killed. You know, I mean, there were still people that died, you know, and you know, innocent, whatever, but it was the kids, you know, and nobody could justify the violence against the kids, and so it hurt the image and kind of killed that movement for a while, right? So it seeks legitimacy, spreads the message. Then as they spread that message, it gets some more sympathy because they framed it as, you know, we're doing the Lord's work, or we're doing Allah's work, you know. And then lastly, it intimidates the people that are not sympathizers, right? So remember, the goal of terrorism is to make social change based upon acts of violence. And so that last thing, the intimidation, is important. All right, I've talked a lot about frames here, and the definition of frames is under debate. But basically, when I say news frame, I'm talking about how the news is packaged in order to create a pattern and a set of emotions that surround the event, right? Now, frames are the basis of how symbols are communicated, right? And it's how it's packaged to be understandable by the popular culture, right? When you frame something, you introduce the characters. You identify who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, who's the innocent victim, right? And what's very vital to realize is the people that package the frame are providing their interpretation, right? Not everybody's going to agree with it, but it's very powerful. And just like, you know, loaded gun, the one that packages that frame is the one that controls the interpretation. And a frame is very superficial because they introduce facts, and you get this idea that it's factual, but the underlying causes are ignored, and it's taken out of context, and the background is not focused on. You know, during the 2008, I think, election, Rand Paul got really hit on really hard because he said something that, when you took it out of context, sounded like it was very racial. And what he was saying was, you know, the Civil Rights Act is not needed today. You know, basically saying that, you know, our society's moving into a post-racial world where we don't have the institutional racism. He wasn't saying that it wasn't needed then, and he wasn't condoning racism. He was just basically saying that, you know, we don't need laws on the books, that we don't have those problems anymore, right? And because it was taken out of context, it didn't sound very good. All right, there's several different types of frames, and I got a couple different slides here to just touch on some of them. And you could probably recognize them. A reporting frame, very superficial, very short, laced with facts, you know. Today, whatever law was voted on, you know, you see it when you watch the news. Then you have the dominant frames, where you have one authority coming on. I hear it a lot on talk radio, where they get the former FBI guy to come in and talk. And I find myself disagreeing with him on his interpretation, but because he's put up as the authority, it's very hard to disagree, because it's a dominant frame. Then you have contest frames, and you see that with the gun control issue. Whenever they have Ted Nugent on, they have somebody else on, you know, and you've got two sides, both experts, and then they contest, they talk back and forth. Then you have the contention frame, where you have a variety, probably 6 different experts, 6 different presenters, and then they all have their different positions. Then we have the investigation frame, where you're coming in to expose corrupt or illegal behavior, and once again, very powerful frame, and it's sometimes taken out of context, right? You have campaigning frames that talk about the broadcaster's opinion. You have reportage frames, which are in-depth coverage with lots of background. Takes more effort, so those are more rare. Community service frames, where you're putting out information for your viewers. Collective interest frames that reinforce common values, where they're introducing a hero, and we get a lot of, affirmative action stories like that, where they're enforcing this particular view, right? Cultural recognition, where you are once again reinforcing a group's values, group norms. And then we have mythic tales, when we get a lot of those of, some of the, military heroes or sports figures giving back to the community, trying to put out this is what a hero is, right, in order to influence behavior, right, because everybody wants to be looked upon as a hero. The problem with frames is not all stories can be framed. Frames are designed to structure a story, but sometimes a story doesn't have any structure. If you look back at 1996, you had TWA Flight 800, takes off, it's flying, and all of a sudden it blows up, right? It defies explanation because we don't have, we still don't have 100% what happened, and it took a long time to piece together a story, right? And because it goes on for a long time, it doesn't really end. It's really hard to have a sustainable news frame, right? Another example of that would be terrorism. Most reporting of terrorism is framed, right? And frames have, just like a picture frame, it puts boundaries to it. It's, and it's got a political beginning, it's got the violence, it's got the eventual end. However, terrorism is a long-standing fight, right? And sometimes that violence becomes ambiguous. Look at gang fights. The Crip shot the Blood, so the Blood shot the Crip, and then because of that, there's another retribution, and you forget what started it. All it is they shot my homeboy yesterday, so I'm going to shoot them tomorrow, right? And so then the next day they come in and they shot us, so now we're going to shoot you, right? So when it's continual, that frame loses meaning, and then it just becomes a cycle of violence. These frames are powerful. They've identified, assault weapons and all these things. And, if you just look at the news, when the news puts out these cultural heroes, right, and they put out the group norms, they define the act. It's very powerful. And if you look back at 9/11, the media defined 9/11, and the news at that time showed that it wasn't just an attack, but it was a clash of civilizations, and only going to war would stop the attacks, right? And I remember very clearly President Bush saying, we're not going to rush into it. When we figure out who did it, we're going to go, and we're going to go and fight until I think it's done. And the media was like, why ain't we shot anybody yet? How come we haven't attacked anybody yet? Right? And then later on, the media changed the way they framed the war and became Bush was a warmonger, right? And so whether you like the guy or not, the media has framed public opinion of his actions. Any way you slice it, media focuses on one thing. It has to have one thing, and that is entertainment. If people don't watch, don't get any ratings, don't get any advertisers, don't have any money, right? A guy named Benjamin Barber, an expert kind of in this, he calls the 24-hour news cycle the infotainment telesector, right? Kind of a play on words. And what he's saying is that it's not geared toward depth. It's not geared toward the facts. It's geared to create revenue, right? You go on here and you look at these shows, you see the hosts interrupt their guests, they provide answers to their own questions. They'll have people on, and then they'll say these things, and they're not really talking about the issue. I did a gun control after Sandy Hook panel on a radio show not too long ago. And, I was kind of the only pro-gun guy there, and they were just blasting the NRA, bless the NRA. And, I told them, I said, look, are we here to talk about guns, the emotions of guns, and that the NRA is evil? Or are we here to talk about the solutions to the problem, right? So when you look at that, you see that Homeland Security, and I'm not talking about Homeland Security as an agency, I'm talking about Homeland Security as our security. There's some negative effects on that because these guys are always leaking documents, unveiling plans, talking about our vulnerabilities, right? You know, used to be the media didn't post things that put the country at a bad light, right? And I don't say we need protectionists in the media, um, but they're not looking at what is needed to have security. They're looking at what gets them the most revenue, right? Now, freedom of press is part of the Constitution. You cannot pick and choose parts of the Constitution that you like, but the press is now becoming part of the story, right? During the Intifada, which is basically a 10-year riot, right, in Israel, the Israeli Defense Force came out of a village. They withdrew from a village on the West Bank, but then they denied. They said, we don't retreat. God's on our side. We don't ever have to back up. Hezbollah came in. They placed a flag in the village, proving that, the IDF wasn't there, photographed it, and then Lebanese television started playing it, right? And they did it specifically to embarrass the IDF. It wasn't because of the news. It was for the embarrassment. And then you look at, Clinton and Iraq. Madeleine Albright came in and they were asked, do you think that this embargo is causing Iraqi children to suffer, right? And she said yes, but it was worth it to keep WMDs out, right? Now they played over here. We were like, it is, okay, so somebody don't get milk with their Cheerios today, but at least they're not going to kill 10,000 Americans with smallpox, right? And so we really didn't care much, but they played that over and over and over in the Middle East. And basically what it turned out to be is Americans were so enthralled with their MTV and our culture that we didn't care that thousands of Iraqi kids were starving to death. And that's how that was played out. Not necessarily true, but that's how it was framed. Let's look at how the TV frames, how they use drama in this, in the patterns, right? They'll come in and they'll say, the situation is changing. The outlook's unknown. So, stay tuned. Stay here with us, right? Information. Our channel has the latest news. In the channels in our network, we've got one channel that has put millions of dollars into their weather service. And then when there's a weather, they cut everything out. If you want the weather, come here, right? Then you get, stay tuned because, when we come back from the break, we've got the best stuff. And then sometimes the TV news plays on their expertise. Only this station is smart enough to explain what's going on, right? Then we've got on scene. Reporters are telling you what's going on, even if nothing's going on, even if they don't know, or even if they're making the situation worse, right? Then you've got, control pattern where the anchor controls the information from the studio, and that kind of psychologically lets you think that they're in charge of the situation, right? Then we've got participation patterns where, they bring you in and let you feel like you are a part of what's going on, we've polls and call in and those sorts of things to help give you the idea that you are a participant, and then we've got the money pattern where they go, okay, we're going to take a break from our sponsors, but when we come back, we've got, and you'll see it, when you watch the news at night, the show, the episode that you want is after a commercial, and it's after 2 or 3 other things because they want you to be locked in, to see what you want to see. As technology changes, and we hear this a lot, we talk about gun control, is the founders didn't foresee, AR-15s, it was muzzleloaders. Well, when they wrote the First Amendment, they didn't foresee the internet, right? The internet is way different from, an inked press. There's really nothing the same. Whereas, at least with an M16, it shares all the same common functionality as a muzzleloading rifle, right? But as technology changes, the way things occur change, right? And the abilities to have force multipliers change. The internet far exceeds conventional media's ability to portray an event. And, it's that loaded gun, but it's a case of loaded guns because now anyone can pick up and present the information. You can get a web account, a website for little or nothing, right? And the internet is one of the most often used communication devices for terrorists, right? You know, email. And as we found out, email is not safe. It's long kind of been thought that if everybody shares the same account and you don't actually email the message, it's just sitting there in drafts, there's nothing to track. But, you know, as we learned with General Petraeus, just sitting on the server, it's not sitting on your computer, so it is moving. You know, it's moving from, say, using Gmail, it's moving from your computer when you save draft. You know, it's traveling to Google's servers out in California, right? So you've got the whole idea that common passwords, one single email account with common passwords is a good means of security. We're finding out that that's not. You know, secured websites, you've got internal emails. You know, that's pretty good security. And the terrorists are constantly understanding what's going on. They're using Google Maps to plan attacks. They're using denial of service attacks. They're using stenography, which is where they embed messages inside the noise inside of pictures. So as technology grows, the terrorists are capitalizing on it. Which some of that is good, not the terrorists using the media, but the fact that the internet is changing the way media works, because there's several issues we have to deal with when we deal with the media. And the best known is bias. We all know the media is biased, but then we also have contagion effects. And then we also have issues of censorship. So we know bias is important and widespread. So let's talk about that first. You know, mainstream media claims objectivity, right? They know that governments and terrorists both are trying to manipulate the stories. And so they seek to be objective. And that's kind of naive because by definition of what a frame is, it's slanted, right? And reporters are expected to create frames that reflect the outlook's orientation. If you work at Fox News, right, there is some conservative bias there. Just like CNN and NBC, MSNBC, whatever, you know, they have some bias. You're not going, you know, I, as a conservative, could not go on and have honest reporting at someplace like, you know, MSNBC, right? Because I couldn't, you know, reflect their orientation, okay? Now, that's kind of mitigated some because the purpose of the media is to create revenue, right? And the majority of viewers of the media are moderate, right? And maybe not moderate because they have made decisions to put them in the middle of the road, but probably moderate in that they reject both sides and they're apolitical, right? And because of that, if the news strays too far to the ends, to the extremes, they're going to alienate their viewers, right? And you know, biased is market based. Drama sells. Many people, you know, watch TV because of their bias, but a lot of people also watch a personality because they hate them and they want to argue, right? You know, when Michael Savage was on the talk radio station that I listened to, you know, people would come on to argue with him as much as people would come on to agree with him. So in 2005, they did a study that showed that media references think tanks that are referenced by liberal Congress members more than think tanks referenced by conservatives. So that tends to indicate a liberal bias, right? If the liberal guy says it, then that gives them some credibility. If the conservative says it, then they don't show it, which loses some credibility, right? Now, there is a concern that bias is not as large a problem as pejorative labels in tabloid journalism because the pejorative labels kind of kill conversation, right? If you and I are debating and you call me a racist, right, the conversation pretty much ends until we deal with that pejorative term. And the same with being called a terrorist, right? If you're calling someone a terrorist, you really can't have any kind of dialogue with them until that you deal with that pejorative label. In tabloid journalism, you know, it is so devoid of facts, right, that it makes the situation really not news anymore, right? I kind of agree with some of that, but biased is very important because many people prefer the entertainment and they want their news to be very easy to digest, and they want somebody to go ahead and determine for them, what they should need, right? Since there's no critical thinking and people are being programmed to accept that bias, I think bias is a huge issue. One of the things that worries me more than anything, right? Big reason that I do what I do is because we're losing our critical thinking, right? We don't have a critical media consciousness where people just do not trust the media. They don't accept it at face value, right? We have a lack of that. So people tend to believe what they hear at the news without doing any kind of investigation on their own. And people aren't looking at the motives for telling the story. There's so much news out there that is not told, right? What are the social constructs? What are the hidden details? How else could that story be told a different way, right? I listen to NPR and those other stations that aren't necessarily the same kind of views that I have, just so I get an idea of the whole picture, right? And just like in intelligence, don't take anything just because one person told you. You need to have 3 or 4 different and independent sources of information. That doesn't mean 3 websites that all are talking about that same primary source, from the AP, right? Or 4 websites that are all, linking back to one originator, right? So independent sources. The idea of the contagion effect is probably deserves its own video. But here's the idea: does the coverage of an event inspire similar events? Right? 1982, Alan Mazur, he studied bomb threats against nuclear facilities, nuclear power plants, and the corresponding media coverage. And he found that as media coverages of the threats increased, so did new threats. But as the media decreased, so did new threats. So more media coverage, more threats; less media coverage, less threats. This is well known with suicides. The suicides are cyclical. When you get a bunch of suicides in a school, you get a lot more. Same with school shootings. Same with bombings. Aircraft hijackings, right? And it's well known in media circles. And a lot of folks, myself included, think this effect can be used positively. If we look at the Israeli standard of reporting terrorist bombings, they do not mention the suicide bomber on air, and all the media framing is about the victims, right? And they go in and they do everything in their power to get the scene cleaned up and life back running within a couple hours, right? And then they just don't mention the bomber. They give him no credit. They don't talk about how evil he is, right? Because if somebody thinks you're a bad person and you're yelling that somebody is being mean to you, right? That kind of plays that, well, an enemy of my enemy must be my friend, right? So maybe if we are more selective in what the media covers or gives credit to, maybe we can change what's going on. And of course, that leads to censorship, right? And when the government deals with the media and censorship, they basically have 3 choices, right? Laissez-faire, let it be as it may. We're going to let them do what they want to do. Then you come in with the idea of censorship, which is what we're kind of moving toward now, meaning, freedom of speech. You have the right to speech, but you do not necessarily have a right to know, right? We have a Freedom of Information Act came out, and people were able to start petitioning the government for documents. Now the government has said, sure, you can get the documents, but here's the deal: you have to pay us, and they're very good or bad depending on your perspective. And when the media comes in and makes a request, then they say, okay, you can have that documents, but we're going to have to charge you manpower and printing and those sorts of costs, and it'll be $10,000, right? So that's censorship. And then have the press regulate themselves, which is kind of the way that in a free market capitalist system, that's what would occur. And I'm for press regulating themselves, but they have to be forced to do that by the consumer. If you don't watch and you make it a point to tell them not only that you don't watch, but you don't support the sponsors of blatantly biased or shallow news reporting, right? Then maybe they will start to be more fair in the way that they present things, right? So I appreciate you listening if you've got this far. Like I said, that is part of a college course, and this little presentation, I had to cut it down for time. But feel free to comment. If you got any questions, you want to make any comments, you like more stuff like this, or you wish I did less of it, whichever, feel free to contact me. You can always catch me online, www.tngun.com. Thank you.